Something terrifying is happening to my parents. After school, I went straight to my mom's office like I always did when I needed to talk. But when I started telling her about the fight I'd had with my girlfriend, she just nodded without really looking at me. "So what should I do?" I prompted. She was quiet for a long time, then said, "I don't know. Just talk to her, I guess," in this uncomfortable voice like she wanted me to leave. I felt my stomach flip. My mom was the person I told everything to. She always knew exactly what to say, but now she was acting like I was bothering her. "Are you okay?" I asked. "Fine, just busy," she said, turning back to her computer even though nothing was on the screen. Then that night at dinner, Dad asked me about the fight with my girlfriend. He wanted to know how I was feeling about it and if I'd figured out what I was going to say to her. My dad never asked about my feelings. I was surprised Mom had even told him about it. Dad and I had the kind of relationship where we'd watch TV together in comfortable silence, and that was enough. "I'm fine," I said, confused. "You don't seem fine," he said gently. "You can talk to me about it if you want." I looked at my mom, but she was just pushing food around her plate and not paying attention to either of us. Something felt deeply wrong, but I couldn't figure out what. The next morning, I woke up to Dad making breakfast. Not just cereal, but actual eggs and toast that he plated nicely. Mom was reading the newspaper at the table but holding it awkwardly, like she wasn't sure what to do with it. "Since when do you cook breakfast?" I asked Dad. "Thought I'd try," he said with this warm smile that looked weird on his face. Mom barely looked up from the paper. She'd always been the one to ask me about my day and make sure I ate something, but now she seemed distant and preoccupied. Thursday afternoon, I failed a chemistry test and came home feeling awful about it. I found Dad in the living room, and before I could stop myself, I was telling him about it, about how stressed I was about college applications, and how I felt like I was disappointing everyone. It felt weird opening up to my dad like that, but the way he was looking at me was so encouraging, and I just kept spilling my guts. He listened to the whole thing, really listened, and then gave me this long, thoughtful response. I almost started crying because my dad had never talked to me like that in my life. He hugged me, this long, tight hug that felt so strange and unfamiliar coming from him. Later, I tried to talk to Mom about the same thing, and she just said, "You'll do better next time," without even looking up from her phone. When I pressed her about it, she got frustrated and said she didn't know what I wanted her to say. This was the woman who'd stayed up with me until 2 in the morning talking me through panic attacks about school. Now she couldn't even pretend to care. I started watching them more carefully after that. Dad would reach out to touch my shoulder or ask how I was doing with this softness that felt completely wrong. Mom kept forgetting to do the little things she always did, like leaving notes in my lunch or asking about my day. They'd look at each other constantly with these nervous, guilty expressions. Saturday morning, Dad tried to help me with my college essay, reading it carefully and giving me detailed emotional feedback about the story I was telling. Mom walked by and barely glanced at it, said it looked fine and kept walking. Every single thing about them felt backwards and wrong. That afternoon, Mom was in the garage organizing Dad's tools, but she kept picking them up and putting them down like she didn't know what they were for. Dad was in the kitchen cooking this elaborate dinner that looked exactly like something Mom would make. When I asked what was going on, they both gave me fake smiles and said nothing was wrong. Sunday evening, I couldn't take it anymore. I walked into the living room where they were sitting on opposite ends of the couch looking miserable. "Something's wrong with you," I said, "both of you, and I need you to tell me what it is right now." They looked at each other with these terrified expressions. Dad started crying, actual tears running down his face, and I'd never seen my father cry ever. Mom put her head in her hands, but she wasn't crying. She just looked scared. "We can't," Dad whispered. "You have to. You won't believe us," Mom said, and her voice was flat and hopeless. "Try me." They were silent for so long I thought they weren't going to answer. Then Dad looked up at me with tears streaming down his face and said, "Something happened to us Tuesday morning. We woke up, and we weren't ourselves anymore." "What does that mean?" Mom stood up and took a step toward me. "We're in each other's bodies," she said, and it came out like a confession she'd been holding in for days. And just like that, I recognized something in her expression. I saw my dad. I sat frozen on the couch, staring at my parents, my brain trying to process what my dad just said through his tears. The words hung in the air like something from a bad science fiction movie, but the fear in their faces looked completely real. My hands gripped the couch cushions, and I couldn't make myself move or speak. Mom was still standing in front of me, and I watched her shift her weight from one foot to the other in this restless way my dad always did when he was uncomfortable. She crossed her arms over her chest, with her hands tucked under her armpits. Another thing my dad did constantly, that my mom never did. I felt my stomach twist, because these tiny movements looked wrong on her body, but completely familiar at the same time. Dad was crying harder now, tears running down his face in a way I'd never seen in my entire life, and he kept wiping at them with both hands, like he didn't know what to do with the emotion. My mom never cried like this either, not with these big, messy sobs, but the way he was hunched over with his shoulders shaking looked exactly like how my mom cried at sad movies. I realized I was searching her face for some sign this was an elaborate prank, some hint that they were messing with me, but all I saw was genuine terror. My hands started shaking and I had to clench them into fists to make it stop. I didn't know if I was more scared that they were lying or that they were telling the truth, and both options felt equally impossible to accept. I finally found my voice and asked them how this could possibly happen. They both started talking at the same time, their words crashing into each other in a jumbled mess. Dad was saying something about waking up wrong and feeling different, while Mom was trying to explain that they didn't understand it themselves and it didn't make any sense. Their voices got louder as they talked over each other, each one desperate to be heard, and I had to hold up my hand to make them stop. The panic in their voices sounded genuine, but nothing they were saying made any actual sense. Mom kept saying she opened her eyes and everything felt heavy and different, and Dad was describing waking up lighter and smaller, and I couldn't tell if they'd rehearsed this story or if they actually believed what they were saying. I asked them to slow down and explain one thing at a time, but they just looked at each other with these helpless expressions, like they didn't know where to start. Dad reached out like he wanted to touch Mom's arm, but then pulled his hand back, and I noticed they were keeping physical distance from each other, like they were scared to get too close. Dad was still crying, and Mom looked like she wanted to run away, so I told them we needed to slow down and figure this out logically. I grabbed a notebook from the coffee table, one I used for homework, and flipped to a blank page. My hands were still shaking, but having something concrete to do helped me focus. I wrote the date at the top, and then Tuesday morning underneath it, trying to organize the chaos into something I could understand. I asked them to tell me exactly what happened when they woke up that day, and they both started talking again, until I held up the pen and told them to take turns. Mom went first, and described opening her eyes and feeling completely disoriented, like she was in the wrong place. She said her body felt too big and heavy, and when she tried to sit up, everything moved differently than she expected. Dad nodded along and said he had the exact opposite experience, waking up feeling small and light in a way that scared him. I wrote down everything they said, even though it sounded crazy, making 2 columns for their separate experiences. The act of writing helped my brain slow down and process what I was hearing instead of just panicking. I made them sit down and walk me through Tuesday morning step by step, and their stories matched about waking up disoriented and confused. Mom described looking in the bathroom mirror and seeing my dad's face staring back at her, and Dad said he saw my mom's reflection and thought he was still dreaming. They both talked about touching their own faces and bodies, trying to understand what was happening and how they'd avoided each other for almost an hour because they were too scared to talk about it. But when I asked specific questions about what it physically felt like, they gave vague answers that didn't sound like they were describing an actual body switch. I asked Mom what was different about having a male body, and she just said everything, which wasn't helpful. I asked Dad if his voice sounded different to himself, and he said yes, but couldn't explain how. The more questions I asked, the more their answers seemed like they were making things up based on what they thought a body switch would feel like, rather than what actually happened. I wrote down every answer anyway, looking for some kind of pattern or proof, but mostly just getting more confused. Mom said they were too scared to tell me right away, because they didn't know what was happening. She explained that they thought maybe it would just reverse itself if they waited, like it was some kind of temporary thing that would fix itself. Dad added that they didn't want to scare me until they understood what was going on, and they kept hoping they'd wake up the next morning back to normal. I felt anger rising in my chest, because they'd been lying to me all week while I thought I was going crazy, noticing all the changes. I asked them how they could let me think something was wrong with me when they knew exactly what was happening, and Mom looked down at her hands with this guilty expression. Dad tried to apologize, but I cut him off because I was too mad to hear it right then. I'd spent days watching them act weird and thinking maybe I was the problem. Maybe I was being too sensitive or reading too much into normal behavior. Now they were telling me they'd known the whole time what was causing it and just didn't tell me. I wrote down lied for 5 days in my notebook with enough pressure that the pen almost went through the paper. I asked if they'd told anyone else or gone to a doctor, and they both looked horrified at the suggestion. Dad said nobody would believe them, and they'd probably get locked up in a psychiatric hospital, which honestly sounded more rational than body swapping. Mom agreed and said they couldn't risk anyone finding out because people would think they were crazy or making it up for attention. I pointed out that maybe a doctor could actually help, or at least run some tests to figure out what was wrong, but they both shook their heads firmly. Dad said there was no medical test for being in the wrong body, and Mom said doctors would just assume they were having some kind of shared delusion. I asked if they'd at least tried Googling it or looking for similar cases, and they admitted they'd been too scared to even search for information. The more they talked about their reasons for keeping it secret, the more it felt like they were just avoiding dealing with the problem. I wrote down, refused medical help, and no research, and stared at the words wondering how my parents could be this irrational. We sat in uncomfortable silence for several minutes while I tried to think of what to even do with this information. My parents were watching me with desperate hope like I was supposed to have answers, but I was 17, and this was completely beyond anything I knew how to handle. I looked down at my notebook with its messy notes and contradictory explanations and realized I had no idea how to help them. If they really believed they'd switched bodies, then something was seriously wrong with their mental health and they needed professional help. But if they were telling the truth, and this was somehow real, then I had no clue what to do about that either. Dad kept wiping his eyes, and Mom kept shifting her weight from foot to foot, and they both looked so scared and lost that I felt bad for being angry at them. I closed the notebook and set it on the coffee table, trying to think of something useful to say or do. The clock on the wall ticked loudly in the silence, and I counted 15 seconds before anyone moved or spoke. Finally, I told them I needed time to think, because my brain felt like it was going to explode from trying to process everything at once. I told them I needed time to think, and went to my room, closing the door behind me and leaning against it for a moment. My legs felt shaky, so I walked over to my bed and sat down in the dark without turning on the lights. The street lamp outside my window cast orange shadows across my floor, and I stared at them, while my thoughts raced in circles. Part of me wanted to believe them because it would explain everything that had been wrong this week, all the weird behavior and personality changes and awkward moments. But the rational part of my brain was screaming that people don't just switch bodies in real life, that this was something from movies and TV shows and not reality. I thought about my mom's distant behavior and my dad's sudden emotional openness and how perfectly it matched what they were claiming. But I also thought about mental illness and shared delusions and how sometimes people could convince themselves of impossible things. I pulled my pillow onto my lap and hugged it while trying to decide what I actually believed. My phone buzzed with a text from my girlfriend asking if I was okay, and I realized I couldn't even begin to explain what was happening. I grabbed my phone and opened the Notes app, starting to make a list of things I could test to see if their claim was real. I typed out questions only the real person would know, like asking my dad about my mom's childhood, or asking my mom about my dad's work projects. But then I realized they'd been married for 20 years, and probably knew most of each other's basic information, so that wouldn't prove anything. I added ideas about watching for habits that should be automatic, like how they made coffee or how they walked or what side of the bed they slept on. I thought about mannerisms and gestures and all the tiny unconscious things people do that define who they are. If my mom was really my dad, she should move like him and react like him and have his automatic responses to things. I kept typing, adding more and more tests to the list, anything I could think of that might give me actual evidence beyond just them acting different. I wrote down ideas about muscle memory and reflexes and whether they'd remember how to do things their original body knew how to do. By the time I finished, the list had 20 items on it, and I still wasn't sure any of them would actually prove anything. I set my phone down on my nightstand and lay back on my bed, staring at the ceiling and wondering if this was actually happening or if my whole family was falling apart in some completely different way that I couldn't see yet. The next morning, I came downstairs and found them both already at the kitchen table with breakfast laid out. I sat down and poured myself orange juice while watching Dad butter his toast. I waited until they were both eating, and then asked Dad what Mom's childhood dog was named. He looked up at me with a confused expression, but then said Biscuit without any hesitation. I turned to Mom and asked what Dad's favorite fishing spot was, and she said the creek behind his uncle's old property up north. Both answers were right, but that didn't prove anything because they'd been married for 20 years, and obviously knew basic facts about each other's lives. I felt frustrated because I'd thought this test would tell me something useful. Dad got up to make more coffee, and I watched him carefully as he moved around the kitchen. He added 3 spoonfuls of sugar to his cup, which was exactly how Mom always made hers, way too sweet for how Dad normally drank it. He stirred it the same way too, tapping the spoon twice on the rim before setting it in the sink. Mom was sitting at the table with Dad's tablet open in front of her, scrolling through news articles really fast without actually reading them, just the way Dad always did when he was killing time before work. She had that same distracted look on her face that Dad got when he was skimming headlines. These tiny details bothered me more than the big personality changes because they felt automatic, like muscle memory that shouldn't transfer between people. I finished my breakfast quickly and left for school without saying much to either of them. At the school, I sat in my first period class and stared at the whiteboard without processing anything the teacher was saying. My mind kept replaying the breakfast scene, trying to figure out what it meant that Dad made coffee like Mom, and Mom read news like Dad. I zoned out completely during the lecture and didn't even realize class had ended until everyone started packing up their bags. In chemistry, I was supposed to be taking notes on a lab procedure, but I just sat there with my pen hovering over blank paper. My chemistry teacher walked by my desk and stopped, asking if I was okay. I looked up at her and said I hadn't been sleeping well, which was true even if it wasn't the whole truth. She told me to see her after class if I needed to talk about making up the test I'd failed last week. I nodded and tried to pay attention for the rest of the period, but kept drifting back to thoughts about my parents. During lunch, I grabbed my food and walked past my usual table where my friends were sitting. I found an empty table in the corner and sat down alone because I couldn't handle normal conversation right now. I pulled out my notebook and opened it to a blank page, then started writing down everything weird I'd noticed about my parents over the past week. I wrote about Mom being distant and forgetting things, about Dad suddenly being emotional and caring, about the way they looked at each other with guilt and fear. I added the stuff from this morning about the coffee and the tablet. I kept writing, filling up 2 pages with observations and trying to find patterns that would explain what was happening. I was looking for some logical explanation that didn't involve body swapping or magic, but the more I wrote, the less sense any normal explanation made. I sat there staring at my notes and feeling more confused than before I'd started. After school, I was walking to my car when Haley appeared next to me in the parking lot. She asked why I'd been avoiding her texts, and I felt my stomach drop because I'd completely forgotten we were supposed to talk about our fight. I tried to explain that family stuff was happening, but when she asked what kind of family stuff, I couldn't give her any details. She looked hurt and said I was shutting her out, that she'd been trying to reach me for days, and I'd barely responded. I felt guilty, but also frustrated because how was I supposed to explain that my parents thought they'd switched bodies? She crossed her arms and waited for me to say something real. She told me she needed me to actually communicate with her, instead of just disappearing whenever things got hard. I snapped back that I was dealing with something really complicated right now, and I couldn't talk about it. She asked why not, and I said she wouldn't understand, which made her even more upset. We stood there in the parking lot arguing while other students walked past us to their cars. She said she was tired of being left in the dark about what was going on with me, that relationships required actual communication and trust. I told her I was doing the best I could, and she said that wasn't good enough. Her voice got louder, and I could see tears starting in her eyes. Finally, she said to call her when I was ready to actually be in this relationship, and then she walked away toward her own car. I watched her go and wanted to run after her, but I didn't know what I could possibly say that would make any of this better. I drove home feeling awful about how I'd handled things with Haley, but also angry that I couldn't tell her the truth. If I told her my parents claimed to be in each other's bodies, she'd think my whole family was crazy and probably break up with me anyway. I pulled into the driveway and sat in my car for a minute trying to calm down before going inside. When I finally walked through the front door, I found both my parents sitting at the kitchen table looking completely exhausted. They had that guilty expression again, like they knew they'd caused problems. I could tell they'd been talking about me before I got home. Dad asked gently how I was doing with everything, using that same soft, worried tone that felt so wrong coming from his voice. I dropped my backpack on the floor and told them honestly that I didn't know what to believe anymore. I said that even if they really thought this body swap thing was real, there had to be some other explanation for what was happening. Maybe they were both sick or stressed or having some kind of shared breakdown. Dad's face crumpled like I'd hurt his feelings, and Mom just stared at the table. Mom said maybe we should just try to act normal and see if the whole thing went away on its own. Something inside me snapped when she said that. I yelled that nothing about this was normal and they couldn't just pretend everything was fine. I told them they'd completely switched personalities and were acting like different people, and they expected me not to notice or care. I said I'd been watching them lie to me all week while I thought I was losing my mind. Mom flinched and Dad started crying again. I felt bad for yelling, but I was so tired of them not being honest about what was really going on. I told them we needed to figure this out for real, not just ignore it and hope it magically fixed itself. They both nodded, but nobody seemed to know what to actually do next. I grabbed my backpack and went upstairs to my room, closing the door harder than I meant to. That night, I lay in bed with my phone, searching the internet for anything about body swapping or consciousness transfer. I found lots of science fiction stories and movie plots, but nothing that suggested it could actually happen in real life. I searched for medical conditions that could cause personality changes and found stuff about brain tumors and mental illness, but nothing that matched what my parents were describing. I looked up shared delusions and folie à deux, reading about how two people could convince each other of impossible things. I felt stupid searching for this stuff like I was some conspiracy theorist looking for proof that aliens were real, but I kept scrolling through search results anyway, getting more desperate for any kind of framework that would help me understand what was happening to my family. Everything I found either proved it was impossible or suggested my parents were seriously mentally ill. Neither option made me feel any better. I finally put my phone down around midnight and stared at the ceiling, knowing I wouldn't be able to sleep, but too exhausted to keep searching for answers that didn't seem to exist. Wednesday morning, I dragged myself downstairs feeling like I hadn't slept at all, and my parents looked worse than me. Dad was at the stove trying to make eggs again, but the smell of burning filled the kitchen. Mom sat at the table staring at her phone screen with completely blank eyes, not even scrolling or reading anything. The eggs turned black in the pan and started smoking. Dad didn't notice until I walked over and turned off the burner myself. He looked at the ruined breakfast like he didn't understand what had happened. Mom never even glanced up from her phone. I grabbed a granola bar and sat down across from her, watching her face for any sign she was actually aware of anything around her. Nothing. She just kept staring at that blank screen like she was looking through it into some other world. I decided to try something different. I asked Dad about the family vacation we took to the beach 5 years ago, the one where we rented that house right on the water. He started telling the story, but got basic facts wrong right away. He said we stayed for 2 weeks when it was actually 10 days. He said the house was blue when it was definitely white with green shutters. He described going deep sea fishing when that never happened at all. I watched Mom's face while he talked and saw her wince every time he got something wrong. Her jaw tightened, and her fingers gripped the phone harder. She wanted to correct him, but was holding herself back. I interrupted Dad and asked Mom if she remembered it differently. She looked up from her phone for the first time that morning and started reciting details. She described the exact layout of the rental house, which bedroom each of us stayed in, the specific restaurant where we ate dinner the first night. She remembered Dad catching a small shark off the pier and how excited he was about it, details I'd completely forgotten. She knew the name of the bait shop where we bought our fishing gear and the type of beer Dad drank while sitting on the deck at sunset. These were Dad's memories, things only he would remember with that level of detail. My stomach felt weird and cold. This actually felt like real evidence that something impossible had happened. But my brain still rejected the whole idea because bodies don't just switch. That's not how reality works. At the school, my chemistry teacher called me to her desk after class and said she'd referred me to the counseling office. She'd noticed I was struggling and thought I could use some support. I felt embarrassed, but also too tired to argue. I went to the counseling office during lunch, and a woman introduced herself as Melanie Lawson. She had a kind face and a calm way of talking that made the small office feel less intimidating. She asked what was going on, and I gave her a very edited version. I said my parents were going through some stuff, and it was stressing me out. I mentioned the fight with my girlfriend and how I couldn't focus on the school. I left out every single weird detail about the body-swapping claim and the personality reversal. Listen to 90 seconds and rate me 5 stars on Spotify. Doing a giveaway for people who did this and show proof on my Instagram. There will be 4 winners, and you get to choose between a Spotify or Amazon gift card. Melanie didn't push for more information than I wanted to share. She just listened carefully and then helped me make an actual plan. She scheduled my makeup chemistry test for the following week and gave me some strategies for managing stress. She wrote down her office hours and said I could come talk anytime I needed to. She handed me her card with her extension number written on it. It was the first genuinely helpful thing anyone had offered me in days. Having someone treat this like a normal problem I could actually solve made me feel slightly less crazy. When I got home that afternoon, I heard noise coming from the garage. I found Mom in there surrounded by Dad's tools, picking them up and putting them down like she was trying to solve a puzzle. She was grouping everything by size instead of by function, the way Dad always organized them. All the screwdrivers together regardless of type. All the wrenches in one pile even though Dad kept them separated by measurement system. She looked completely lost and frustrated, holding a socket wrench and staring at it like she'd never seen one before. When she noticed me watching from the doorway, she just shook her head and walked past me into the house without saying anything. I went inside and found Dad in the kitchen starting dinner. He was actually doing a good job this time, moving around the space with confidence. He hummed while he chopped vegetables, using the exact rhythm and technique Mom always used. He checked the rice cooker the way she did, lifting the lid and stirring with a specific motion I'd seen her do 1,000 times. He seasoned the chicken with her combination of spices without even looking at the bottles. Every single gesture and mannerism was completely wrong coming from Dad's body. Watching him move through the kitchen with Mom's habits and patterns made me feel physically sick. My throat got tight, and my hands started shaking. During dinner, I couldn't take the tension anymore. I put down my fork and asked them directly if anything else happened last Tuesday, besides waking up wrong. They both froze and looked at each other with guilty expressions. The silence stretched out for what felt like forever. Finally, Dad admitted they'd started couples therapy the week before The therapist had given them a homework assignment for the week. Mom explained reluctantly that the assignment was about understanding each other's perspective. They were supposed to take on each other's roles in the family for 1 week. Dad was supposed to be more emotionally available and handle more of the household management. Mom was supposed to step back from organizing everything and let Dad handle the emotional labor. They were supposed to learn what it felt like to be in each other's position. And then Tuesday morning, this whole body swap thing happened right in the middle of the exercise. I felt this huge rush of relief flooding through me. This actually made sense as a real explanation. They were just doing a therapy exercise that got out of hand somehow. Maybe they'd gotten too deep into the role-playing and convinced themselves something supernatural had happened. Maybe the stress of pretending to be each other had caused some kind of shared breakdown. This was a rational answer that didn't involve magic or science fiction. But then Dad insisted it was more than just the exercise. He said something actually changed Tuesday morning that they couldn't explain, something real and physical that happened to them. My hope for a normal explanation crumbled apart. We were right back to the impossible claim that they'd somehow switched bodies, and I still didn't know what to believe or how to help them. I stared at them sitting there looking miserable and asked why they didn't just tell me about the therapy from the start instead of letting me think I was going crazy. Mom shifted in her seat and looked down at her hands. She said they were embarrassed about needing help with their marriage and thought they could handle the exercise themselves without involving me. Dad nodded and added that they didn't want me to worry or think their relationship was in trouble. I felt frustration building because this was exactly the kind of thing they should have told me, especially once they started acting so weird that I noticed. The fact that they'd been lying about the therapy made me wonder what else they weren't telling me. Mom kept insisting the body swap thing was real and not just the therapy exercise, but I couldn't make myself believe in something so impossible. I told them I needed to be alone and went upstairs to my room. I sat on my bed staring at my phone for a long time before I finally opened my messages with Haley. I typed out an apology for how I'd acted and asked if we could talk this weekend. I added that I knew I'd been distant and I was sorry for shutting her out. I hit send and then just sat there watching the screen. She didn't respond right away, and I felt my anxiety getting worse with every minute that passed. Finally, after what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 minutes, she texted back just one word. Okay. That single word told me everything about how much damage I'd done by pushing her away. She wasn't asking questions or trying to make plans or doing any of the things she normally would. Just okay, like she was agreeing to something she didn't really want to do. I knew I'd hurt something between us that might not heal easily. Thursday morning, I woke up to the smell of coffee and went downstairs to find Mom in the kitchen making breakfast. She looked up when I walked in and actually smiled, asking how I'd slept and if I wanted eggs or cereal. It wasn't the warm, enthusiastic way she used to be, but it was the first time all week she'd seemed even slightly like herself. I told her eggs would be good, and she nodded and started cooking. She asked me what I had going on at the school today, and actually listened when I told her about my classes. We had an almost normal conversation about my history project and whether I'd finished my English homework. It felt strange but good, like maybe whatever was wrong with her was starting to get a little better. Dad came down while we were talking and immediately started hovering, asking if I was okay and how I was feeling about everything that happened last night. He wanted to know if I'd slept well and if I needed to talk about my emotions. I told him I was fine and just wanted to eat breakfast and get ready for school. He kept pushing, though, asking if I was sure and saying it was important to process difficult experiences. I could feel myself getting annoyed with how much he was checking on me. After breakfast, Dad followed me around asking more questions about my feelings and whether I wanted to talk before school. He kept touching my shoulder and giving me these concerned looks that made me want to scream. Finally, I turned around and told him I needed some space and that his constant hovering was making everything worse instead of better. His face fell, and he looked genuinely hurt, but he nodded and said he understood. He backed off and went into the living room, and I felt guilty, but also relieved to have some breathing room. I grabbed my backpack and left for school without saying goodbye. At the school, I went straight to the counseling office during my free period. Melanie saw me in the waiting area and waved me into her office with a friendly smile. She asked how things were going at home, and I took a deep breath before admitting that my parents were going through something really difficult that was affecting the whole family. I didn't give her the crazy details about body swapping, just said they were struggling and it was stressing everyone out. She listened carefully and then suggested that family therapy might be helpful for all of us to work through whatever was happening together. She pulled out a folder and gave me some referral cards for therapists who specialized in family counseling. I took them even though I wasn't sure my parents would agree to go, especially after they'd already been hiding their couples therapy from me. Melanie said I could come talk to her anytime I needed support, and I thanked her and left feeling slightly less alone in dealing with this mess. In chemistry class, I forced myself to focus completely on what the teacher was saying. I took detailed notes and asked questions when I didn't understand something, trying to prove to myself that I could still function like a normal student despite everything falling apart at home. My teacher noticed the extra effort and came up to my desk after class. She told me she'd scheduled my makeup test for next Tuesday and said she was glad to see me engaging with the material again. I thanked her and felt a small sense of accomplishment that at least one part of my life was getting back on track. After school, I got in my car but couldn't make myself drive straight home. I needed time to think without my parents' fear and stress pressing down on me. I drove around town for a while with no destination in mind, just moving through familiar streets and trying to clear my head. Eventually, I ended up at the park where Haley and I had our first date last spring. I parked and sat there remembering how simple everything had felt back then, when my biggest worry was whether she liked me back and my parents were just regular parents who acted like themselves. I missed feeling like my life made sense and I had control over things. Now everything felt upside down and wrong. When I finally made myself go home, both my parents were sitting in the living room waiting for me. They had matching nervous expressions that made my stomach tighten. Dad stood up as soon as I walked in and said they needed to tell me something else. My heart sank because I honestly didn't know how much more weirdness I could handle. I dropped my backpack and sat down on the chair across from them, bracing myself for whatever new impossible thing they were about to claim. Mom leaned forward with her hands clasped together and started explaining that she'd been feeling foggy and disconnected beyond just the role reversal thing. She said it was like her thoughts were moving through thick mud and she couldn't quite grab onto them properly. Then she admitted she'd started a new medication 2 weeks ago for anxiety and hadn't thought to mention it because she didn't connect it to all the other changes happening. She said her doctor had prescribed it to help with stress at work, but she'd been feeling increasingly spaced out and forgetful since she started taking it. I felt this huge wave of anger and relief crash over me at the same time. This was finally a real, concrete, medical explanation for at least part of what was happening. I asked her why she didn't tell her doctor the medication was making her feel wrong, and she looked down at her lap. She said she thought the side effects would get better after her body adjusted, and she didn't want to seem like she was complaining or being difficult. She admitted she should have said something sooner, but she'd been embarrassed about needing medication in the first place. Dad wiped his eyes and looked at me with this exhausted expression I'd never seen on his face before. He started explaining how scared he'd been watching Mom zone out during conversations and forget things she'd always remembered, like she was fading away somehow. He said that's why he'd been trying so hard to take care of everything, to fill in the gaps she was leaving, but it just made him feel more panicked because nothing he did seemed to help. Mom was staring at the floor, and I could see her hands shaking slightly in her lap. I suddenly understood that they'd both been stuck in their own separate fear spirals this whole time, Dad overcompensating and exhausting himself while Mom withdrew further into the fog, and neither of them had actually dealt with the real problems because they were too busy being terrified. I felt this surge of frustration mixed with something like pity because they were supposed to be the adults, but they'd completely fallen apart. I stood up and told them we needed to call Mom's doctor right now, tonight, and explain exactly what was happening with the medication side effects. I said we also needed to actually do the family therapy they'd mentioned because it was obvious none of us could handle this mess alone anymore. They both looked up at me with these relieved expressions, like they'd been waiting for someone to just make decisions and tell them what to do. Dad nodded and said that made sense, and Mom agreed in this quiet voice that sounded more present than she'd been in days. I grabbed my phone and pulled up Mom's doctor's contact information, then handed it to her and told her to leave a message about needing an urgent appointment. She took the phone with shaking hands and walked into the kitchen to make the call, while Dad and I sat in heavy silence. When she came back, she said the office was closed, but she'd left a detailed message about the side effects and asked them to call first thing in the morning. I told them both to go to bed because they looked completely wiped out and I'd see them in the morning. That night, I lay awake feeling this weird mix of anger that it had gotten this bad and relief that we finally had concrete steps to take. Friday morning, I woke up to my phone buzzing with a text from Mom saying the doctor's office had called back and scheduled an emergency appointment for that afternoon at 2:30. I went downstairs and found both my parents in the kitchen looking nervous, but also more alert than they'd been all week. I told Mom I could skip school and go to the appointment with her, but she shook her head and said she needed to do this herself, and Dad would go with her for support. I felt a little hurt that she didn't want me there, but also relieved I wouldn't have to sit in a doctor's office dealing with medical stuff. I grabbed breakfast and headed to the school, and the whole morning I felt distracted, but in a completely different way than before. Instead of the anxious confusion I'd been carrying around, I felt this cautious hope that we were finally taking real steps to fix things. During chemistry class, I actually paid attention and took notes, and my teacher gave me this small smile like she was glad to see me engaged again. At lunch, I was sitting alone at a corner table picking at my food when Haley appeared and sat down across from me. She had this careful expression on her face and asked if I was ready to actually talk now, not like before when I'd been shutting her out. I put down my sandwich and told her as much as I could without sounding completely insane, explaining that my parents were having serious problems and it had been affecting me way more than I'd realized. I said I was sorry for disappearing on her and making her feel like I didn't care about our relationship. She listened without interrupting, just watching my face, and when I finished, she was quiet for a minute. Then she said she needed to know I wouldn't just shut her out every time things got hard at home, that she wanted to be there for me, but I had to actually let her in. I promised I'd try to do better and keep her in the loop even when stuff was messy. We agreed to take things slow and keep communicating, and even though we weren't completely okay yet, it felt like we might actually be able to fix this. She reached across the table and squeezed my hand, and I felt some of the weight lift off my chest for the first time in over a week. The rest of the school day went by faster, and I kept checking my phone hoping for an update from my parents. When I finally got home that afternoon around 3:30, both of them were already back from the doctor and sitting at the kitchen table. Mom looked completely exhausted, but her eyes seemed clearer somehow, less foggy and distant. Dad explained that the doctor had agreed the medication was definitely causing the cognitive side effects Mom had been experiencing, the spacing out and memory problems and emotional numbness. They'd switched her to a different medication that should work better for her anxiety without making her feel disconnected from everything. The doctor also referred Mom to a psychiatrist who specializes in anxiety disorders for better long-term management and had recommended we do family therapy to help all of us cope with the stress of the past few weeks. Hearing a medical professional validate that something was actually wrong, that we weren't all just imagining the changes, made me feel way less crazy about everything. Mom reached over and squeezed my hand and thanked me for pushing them to get help, and I felt this uncomfortable mix of pride and sadness that I'd had to be the one to fix things. Over the weekend, we were all really gentle with each other, like we were walking on eggshells, but in a caring way instead of a scared way. Mom was adjusting to the new medication and said it would take a few days to really kick in, but she was already engaging more with daily life, asking me questions about school and actually listening to my answers. Dad was still doing more emotional labor than he normally would, checking in on both of us and trying to keep things running smoothly, but it felt less overwhelming and desperate than before. Saturday, we ordered pizza and watched a movie together, and it was almost normal except for the careful way we were all treating each other. Sunday evening at 6, we had our first family therapy session with Alethea Padilla in her office across town. I was really nervous walking in, not sure what to expect or how much we'd have to talk about the weird body swap claim my parents had made. The office was small and comfortable with soft chairs and calm colors, and Alethea was this middle-aged woman with kind eyes who immediately made me feel less anxious. She asked us each to explain our perspective on what had been happening, and I went first, describing how my parents had suddenly switched personalities and behaviors. Mom went next and talked about the medication fog and feeling disconnected, and Dad explained about the couple's therapy exercise and trying to be more emotionally available. Alethea listened carefully to all of us without judgment, taking notes and nodding, and when we finished, she sat back and looked at us with this thoughtful expression that made me feel like maybe she actually understood what we'd been through. Alethea leaned forward and folded her hands on her lap. She explained that what we'd experienced was probably a combination of things happening at the same time. Mom's medication was causing side effects that made her feel disconnected and foggy, like her brain wasn't working right. At the exact same time, Dad was trying to do the couple's therapy homework about switching roles and being more emotional. So Mom felt like she wasn't herself because of the medication, and Dad was acting completely different because of the therapy assignment. When those two things happened together, it created this confusing situation where they both felt wrong in their own bodies. She said the brain sometimes tries to make sense of weird feelings by creating explanations, even impossible ones like body swapping. Mom's brain was trying to understand why she felt so strange and disconnected, and seeing Dad act out of character made that feeling even stronger. Alethea looked at each of us and said the important thing was that we were here now, getting help and figuring out what really happened. My parents both nodded, and I saw some of the fear leave their faces. She gave us homework for the week, stuff about practicing clear communication and separating the therapy exercise from real life. She told my parents they needed to just be themselves instead of trying to act like each other, and that the role reversal assignment had clearly gone wrong. Mom and Dad looked embarrassed, but also relieved, like they'd been waiting for permission to stop pretending. We scheduled another session for the following week and left the office. The drive home was quiet, but it felt different from the scared silence from before. Monday morning, I woke up feeling less anxious than I had in weeks. I got to the school early and went straight to the main office to check in about my chemistry makeup test. The secretary directed me to the testing room where I sat down with the exam. It wasn't easy, but I could actually focus this time, without my brain spinning about what was happening at home. I finished the test feeling okay about it, not confident I'd aced it, but pretty sure I'd at least passed. When I turned it in, my chemistry teacher smiled and said she was glad to see me looking more focused. After third period, I stopped by the counseling office, and Melanie was at her desk. She waved me in and asked how things were going. I told her my family had started therapy, and my mom was switching medications, and that everything felt like it was getting better. Melanie said she was really proud of me for helping my family get the support they needed, and that took a lot of courage for a teenager. She reminded me I could come talk to her any time if things got hard again. At lunch, I found Haley sitting at our usual table and sat down across from her. We started talking about normal stuff like her college essay and whether she was going to apply early decision anywhere. She told me about this huge fight she'd had with her parents over her major choice, and I actually listened and asked questions instead of being stuck in my own head. It felt good to support her for once, instead of always being the one with problems. She reached across the table and squeezed my hand and said it was nice to have me back. We made plans to hang out over the weekend, and it felt like we were finding our way back to normal. That week, I started noticing small changes in Mom. Tuesday morning, she asked me specific questions about my chemistry test and actually remembered the details when I told her about it. Wednesday, she left a note in my lunch like she used to, just a silly drawing of a cat. Thursday evening, she initiated a conversation about college applications instead of just responding when I brought it up. By Friday, she seemed more present and engaged, less like she was watching life happen from behind a wall. Friday night after dinner, she pulled me aside and apologized for scaring me. She said she hadn't realized how bad things had gotten until I forced everyone to face it, and she was grateful I'd pushed them to get help. I hugged her and felt like I was hugging my actual mom again, not some distant version of her. Dad was changing too, but in the opposite direction, pulling back from the constant emotional check-ins and hovering. Monday evening, we watched TV together without him asking how I was feeling every 5 minutes. It was just comfortable silence like we used to have, and I realized how much I'd missed that. He wasn't being cold or distant, just being himself instead of trying to be Mom. We fell into a better balance where he was available if I needed to talk, but not overwhelming me with concern. Wednesday night, we sat together watching a nature documentary, and it felt like getting back a piece of our old relationship that I'd thought was gone forever. Sunday evening, we had our second session with Alethea. This time, she had us practice active listening, where one person talked and the others had to repeat back what they heard before responding. It felt awkward and forced at first, like we were reading from a script, but it actually helped us realize how much we'd been talking past each other instead of really hearing what the other person was saying. We talked about how keeping secrets and not communicating had made everything worse. Dad admitted he should have told me about the therapy homework from the start. Mom said she should have reported the medication side effects to her doctor right away, instead of hoping they'd go away. I confessed that I should have asked for help sooner, instead of trying to figure everything out alone. Alethea said we'd made really good progress and scheduled our next session for 2 weeks out instead of 1. The following Tuesday, Mom had an appointment with a psychiatrist that her regular doctor had recommended. She was gone for almost 2 hours and came back looking tired but hopeful. Over dinner, she explained that the psychiatrist had given her a better treatment plan for her anxiety, different medication that shouldn't cause the thinking problems and foggy feeling. She said the new doctor had actually listened to her concerns and taken them seriously instead of just dismissing the side effects. She told me later while we were doing dishes that she felt like she was waking up from a fog. I could see her personality coming back in small ways each day, the way she hummed while cooking, how she organized the mail, the specific way she folded towels. 2 weeks after everything had fallen apart, I was sitting in the living room on a Thursday afternoon doing calculus homework. Mom came in from the kitchen carrying a mug of tea and set it down next to me without saying anything. It was made exactly how I liked it with honey and lemon, and she hadn't asked if I wanted it, just knew. It was such a small, normal thing, but I felt my throat get tight because it meant she was really coming back to us. She sat down on the couch with her own tea and started reading, and we just existed in the same space comfortably like we used to. Saturday morning, Dad woke me up early and asked if I wanted to go fishing. We hadn't been in months, not since before all the weirdness started. We drove out to his favorite spot by the lake and set up our chairs on the dock. We didn't talk much, just cast our lines and watched the water. It felt right in a way that all Dad's emotional conversations hadn't, just being together without needing to process everything. On the drive home, he turned down the radio and thanked me for pushing them to get help. He said he was sorry I'd had to be the adult when they were falling apart. I told him it was okay, and that I was just glad they were both acting like themselves again. He reached over and squeezed my shoulder, and that simple gesture felt more like my dad than all the long hugs and deep conversations had. The following Friday, I asked Haley if she wanted to come over for dinner, and she said yes, which made me more nervous than it should have. My parents knew we were back together, but this felt like a test of whether they could actually act normal around someone outside the family. Mom made her usual lasagna, and Dad set the table without being asked, and when Haley arrived, they were just themselves with her. Dad asked about her college applications, and Mom wanted to know if she was still playing soccer, and it was the kind of easy conversation we used to have before everything got weird. They weren't trying too hard to be friendly or acting distant and uncomfortable, just being regular parents having dinner with their son's girlfriend. After Haley left, I was loading the dishwasher when Mom came into the kitchen and started putting away leftovers. She worked quietly for a minute, and then said it was really nice to see me happy again, and I realized she was right. For the first time in weeks, I actually felt good, instead of anxious and worried all the time. The next Wednesday, we had our third session with Alethea, and we spent most of it talking about what we'd learned from everything that happened. Mom explained how she'd stopped trusting herself to know when something was wrong, and Dad admitted he'd been so focused on fixing things that he hadn't actually listened to what anyone needed. I told them I'd learned to ask for help, instead of trying to solve everything alone, and Alethea said that was exactly the kind of growth she hoped families would get from therapy. She asked if we felt like we had better tools now for handling stress and communicating when things got hard, and we all agreed we did. Then she said we'd made really remarkable progress and suggested we move to monthly sessions instead of weekly, which felt like a huge milestone. It meant she thought we were stable enough to manage on our own most of the time, that we weren't in crisis mode anymore. A month after everything fell apart, I was sitting at dinner on a regular Tuesday night, and everyone was just being themselves. Mom asked how my college essay was coming, and actually listened when I explained what I was writing about. Dad made some dumb joke about my topic, and Mom rolled her eyes at him the way she always used to. We talked about normal stuff like weekend plans and whether we needed groceries and what was on TV later. I looked around the table at my parents eating and talking and being completely ordinary, and thought about how close we'd come to losing this. We'd almost destroyed our normal life because we were too scared to tell the truth and too proud to ask for help. But we'd found our way back by finally being honest about what was happening and letting other people support us through it. Things weren't perfect, but they were real again, and that was enough. And that's a wrap for today. Thanks for sticking around till the end. It really means a lot to me. I hope this story made your day just a little brighter. Subscribe and come back soon. We've got plenty more good ones ahead.